Hi, welcome to this video on motivation for core management concepts. And our first focus today is on what actually is motivation. So motivation can mean a number of different things, but they're very related. So I've put up a few definitions or ideas here. And if you keep these in mind as you are covering this unit, then you will be very well served. So firstly, we can see motivation as referring to the forces within or beyond a person that arouse and sustain their commitment to a course of action. So in other words, motivation gets you going and keeps you going on the thing that you should be focusing on. When we say that someone is motivated at work, there's a key problem here. Firstly, it can either mean that they're motivated to do their job just as is required of them. So like, I'm motivated to record this video, or it can mean that they're motivated to go above and beyond the requirements of their role, so that you're motivated to do something on top of that. So if, for example, we take someone who works in McDonald's, who is working on the tills, motivated to complete their job is one thing, motivated to stay for an extra half an hour to talk to customers afterwards to help keep them happy would be quite another thing. The manager needs to be aware of what it is that motivates their staff and how they can help in achieving staff motivation. So these three elements of what we're interested in. We're interested in what motivation is, the fact that it can mean two quite different things, and the fact that the manager needs to play a role in helping to motivate people. When we look at motivation, we can divide it down into two categories. We can have extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, and these are the two elements of why we do what we do. Intrinsic motivation comes about because we are interested in and enjoy the task itself that we're doing. So this intrinsic motivation might come about as a result of enjoyment, purpose, growth, curiosity, passion, self-expression, or fun. So if you think of a hobby that you really like doing, the chances are that hobby fulfills multiple of these intrinsic motivational factors. Secondly, we can look at extrinsic motivation. So this is the motivation that comes about as a result of doing the task. So the task itself doesn't motivate you, but the rewards that doing the task promises, they motivate you. Whether that in the work context is promotions or pay rises, bonuses, benefits, prizes, winning, perks, whatever it might be, it's not the task itself, it's something from outside the task. Now we're going to look at a series of motivation, which all come from slightly different angles. You'll see these also in the notes. They're all covered in the notes. This is just a brief summary of each of the main ones, so you have something else to work with. So the first one we'll look at is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this talks to motivation quite significantly. Maslow was a clinical psychologist who argued that we have innate needs as human beings, and that those needs motivate us to do things because we are motivated to satisfy those needs. The needs come in 9 levels stacked in order, but a simplified version of his model just boils this down to 5 different levels, which are physiological, safety, belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization, which you can see stacked on the pyramid to the right-hand side of this slide. We meet our needs in a personal order and to a certain extent before we work up to the next need. So for example, physiological need, we need food and we need water and we need oxygen to be able to survive. However, we don't only focus on that need all the time, because at some point we're not that thirsty, we're not that hungry, we can concentrate on something else. The next need is safety. So that's the sense that we have the security that we need to stay alive. Then belongingness, that we feel like we're part of a group. That will remind you of the Hawthorne studies, no doubt. Then esteem, so that we feel that we are a good person, that we're happy with who we are. And then self-actualization, the sense that we're developing, growing, that we are the best version of ourselves. For most people, the pyramid follows this order, but it's only indicative. So for example, some people will put the sense of esteem or self-actualization before belongingness. Belongingness might be the final thing at the top of their pyramid. It's called a content theory. It's a content theory because it's sort of like a tick box exercise. It says what things at the box of our life needs for us to be motivated. What do we need to put in that box? What contents does that box need in order for us to be motivated? There's some examples of some needs and some ways to satisfy them. So here are the 5 main categories from Maslow. And what I would suggest is that you pause this slide before moving on and have a read through these different categories, but I'm just going to pick on a couple of them. So if, for example, you are looking for safety, And then we think about an example of a manager working hard to help an employee satisfy that need for safety. Amazon had introduced working well to reduce sprains and strains from repetitive motion. Also, if you've recently seen the movie American Factory, you'll have seen the workers warming up before they go to work on the factory floor to avoid muscle strains. We could also look at something like esteem. So that's the idea of recognition, attention, appreciation, respect of others, company awards, and so forth. So the long-running employee of the month in McDonald's is a good example of that. The next theory that we'll look at is expectancy theory, which comes from Victor Vroom in 1964, but it's still very prominent. This theory looks at how you become motivated and hence is a process theory. So it's about the process of motivation. And it proposes that as an individual, your motivation will depend on whether you firstly expect your efforts to result in good performance. So if you put in the effort, will you be able to perform? That's called expectancy. Secondly, do you believe that you'll receive the reward if you do perform well? So that's instrumentality. And thirdly, do you value the reward? That's valence. And the extent to which each of the above is true will affect the extent to which you'll be motivated. So let's look at this here. So if you put in an individual effort, does it lead to individual performance? Does individual performance lead to a reward? Do you get rewarded for performing well in your organisation? And does the reward match your personal goals? So do you care about that reward? So another way of saying it again is that motivation depends on whether effort will lead to desired performance, whether performance will lead to a given outcome, and indeed whether that outcome is attractive. And the implications for managers of expectancy theory are, firstly, it recognises that not everyone is motivated by the same rewards, and therefore that a value of a reward might be different for different people and could change over time. So what was valuable to me when I was 21 is probably quite different to what is valuable to me now as a parent. Managers need to offer rewards that staff value. So they need rewards packages that work for everybody who's employed there. And companies increasingly have flexible benefits packages. You can choose which of the things you have up to a certain value. What's expected in terms of performance needs to be really clear for this to work as well, because you have to know that you're performing in the right way. And training should be used to help staff improve performance, because that will help to motivate them, because they'll be able to attain the rewards that you're offering, which is only a good thing. And finally, employees will focus on the activities they're rewarded for and ignore the others, according to this theory. So you need to be careful to reward the right things. So if you're a company, for example, where group work is really important, then having some rewards available for doing well in groups will be important, not just to have incentives for working individually. The third theory that we'll look at in terms of motivation then is equity theory, again from the 60s, this time from Adams. And this is concerned specifically with perceptions of fairness and unfairness and the impacts that those have on motivation. And it's looking at how you want to have a sense that the rewards that you're being offered for your contribution are equal to the rewards that someone else is being offered for their contribution. So in other words, your rewards divided by your efforts and contributions need to equal someone else's rewards divided by their efforts and contributions. This can be quite hard to apply. So what it sort of means, and we'll go on in a moment to that slide on unfairness that I just showed you, but just to explain in slightly more detail, it doesn't mean that everyone has to have the same rewards, but what it means is that you need to have a sense that if you're working really hard, you're being rewarded for it, whereas if someone else is only working averagely hard, they're only being averagely rewarded, because then you create the same sort of ratio. And if we have a lack of equity, so if we perceive that it's unfair, that we're being unfairly treated, it can lead us to feeling very tense, and it can certainly lead to us feeling demotivated, and it can also drive us to resolve the unfairness. We treat a modest amount of over reward as a lucky happening. So if we are over rewarded to a degree, then we're okay with that. But we don't like a modest amount of under reward. We see that as intolerable. And I remember precisely this when I was working in a conference organizer in my gap year, and I found out that someone who'd come in on exactly the same level as me was being paid £500 a year more. £500 a year, people, hardly worth quibbling about. Wasn't worth quibbling about in the early 2000s either, like just not important. But I felt so badly treated, because not only was she paid more, but I was also training her, even though we were on the same level. I found it intolerable. And I remember storming downstairs in my platform shoes to the boss saying, it's unfair. And he said, but Katie, I didn't even realise I'd done it. Of course, have another £500. My goodness, I'm sorry. And then it was all resolved. But I found it really unfair. Whereas if it had been around the other way, I'd have just taken it, been more than happy with it, and would have assumed it was because I was more senior than her. Interestingly, though, we also work harder if we're overpaid to try and increase the sense of equity. So it can be a way to drive better performance. And then the final box on the left-hand side, staff can make different choices to restore perceived equity. So in other words, if things feel unfair, there's a range of different things that you can do. We go into more details on these in the notes, but it's things like altering your input, so doing more or doing less, seeking better rewards, changing who you compare yourself to, and so forth. But I'm going to let you read about that in the notes. So the management implications of this are that equity, if achieved, improves job satisfaction and organisational commitment. So you are more likely to be committed to an organisation that you think treats you fairly than one that doesn't. Equity theory requires measurement of some quite abstract notions such as effort, ideas, benefits, and recognition. It's also hard to unpick why staff are feeling a lack of equity and to take action that's acceptable to all parties, because lots of it's in the mind. What seems unfair to one person might not seem unfair to another, because there'll be a degree of subjectivity as what we count as a reward versus what we count as a contribution, and how heavily or lightly we rank those and weight those. So it's highly individual as to who people also see as a relevant comparison. Who should I compare myself to? Who should you compare yourself to? And some people are actually just more comfortable with a degree of inequity than others. I clearly showed at that point I wasn't. I don't know if I'd have the same response now if it was just £500. I might just shrug. But it can be really hard for managers to predict, to discuss, and to manage that process of dealing with inequity. So it's better not to run up against it in the first place. But then again, it's all in the eye of the beholder, very subjective. So it's hard to go a year as a manager without some sense of inequity from one of your staff members. Okay, and then we're going to look at goal setting theory, which is again a very different type of motivational theory. This looks precisely at what makes work itself motivating. So the tasks that you do, the things that you do as part of your job, what makes those into motivating things. And it finds that challenging goals lead to better performance in comparison to unchallenging goals. So we like to be challenged. We're likely to do better if we're challenged. Specific goals lead to better performance than vague goals. So we're more likely to perform if we know precisely what's expected of us. But participation in goal setting can increase commitment to the goals and thus increase performance. So we're more likely to work hard to meet a goal if we've been involved in deciding what the goal is. And finally, feedback on past performance is necessary because it contains information and is motivational. So it's no good just constantly looking forward. You need some self-reflection and you need people to feedback on how you've done in the past. And all of these things, if a company or a manager can deliver them, will make work more satisfying and ultimately motivate staff more. So many managers, when they're setting goals for workers or working with workers to set goals, will use the SMART acronym because it plays into goal setting theory. And that's the idea that goals that are set for workers should be SMART. So they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. And these things will help workers be able to achieve those goals and therefore also feel motivated to achieve those goals. Again, there's more on this in the notes. I'd suggest reading it there. And also you can find a plethora of resources on this online if you type in SMART goal setting. The management implications then for SMART goal setting and for goal setting theory are that it's highly, highly practical, providing very clear ways to set motivating goals. And there's growing research all the time that suggests it works. It also focuses specifically on intrinsic motivation and on the experience of the on-the-job work that you do to make it more motivating. So it's very focused not on reward, not on the expensive things, but on the task itself. But there are challenges in applying it in contemporary workplaces. In particular, it's mainly being tested in settings that have clear, quantifiable short-term goals because they're easier to study. But it also suggests that it's harder to use them in complex environments with non-quantifiable longer-term goals. It's not as applicable. It could also restrict spontaneous helping. So in other words, that, oh, I'll give you a hand, if the focus on goal achievement is too great, because people become so focused on their goals to the detriment of the team and the sense of team performance. It could also inhibit initiative for a similar reason, because people become entrenched in meeting the goals, and it can lead to counterproductive behaviours if the wrong goals are rewarded. So, for example, if you're hoping for teamwork but reward the individual members instead, so rather than having something that feels more team. So they're the main theories. Whistle stop through them. For the exam, really important for you to understand how they're different and to be able to compare and contrast them. There's resources and questions in the units that will help you to do so, and you should also talk to your tutor as much as you can to make sure you're really clear on the differences between the theories and how to make use of them in the exam. Thank you for listening. Bye.